The rusted bell above Murphy's auto repair chimed softly as another customer pushed through the weathered door. Outside, the sleepy town of Cedar Falls went about its quiet afternoon routine, unaware that within these oil-stained walls lived one of the military's most dangerous secrets. Thomas Murphy, 73 years old with calloused hands and a gentle smile, looked up from the engine he was rebuilding. His grey coveralls bore decades of honest work, and his kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he greeted each visitor like family. But beneath this humble exterior lay a past so classified that even mentioning it could trigger protocols most people couldn't imagine. The young soldier who walked through that door on a crisp October morning had no idea he was about to uncover a truth that would change everything he thought he knew about honor, duty, and the price of keeping America's darkest secrets buried forever in unmarked graves. Sergeant Jake Morrison shifted his weight nervously as he explained the problem with his Ford pickup. The 24-year-old had recently returned from deployment, and civilian life still felt foreign after months in hostile territory. Murphy listened intently, nodding with the patience of someone who had heard countless similar stories over the years. His workshop was a sanctuary of organized chaos. Tools hung precisely on pegboards, spare parts labeled in neat handwriting, and classic rock playing softly from a paint-splattered radio. The old man moved with surprising grace for his age, his weathered fingers dancing across engine components with surgical precision. As he worked, Murphy shared gentle wisdom about patience, about taking time to understand what was truly broken before rushing to fix it. Jake found himself oddly comforted by the mechanic's presence, something about the way Murphy carried himself, suggesting depths of experience that went far beyond fixing transmissions and brake lines in small-town America. The discovery happened purely by accident. Jake had been helping Murphy retrieve a specialized wrench from the bottom drawer of an old toolbox when a worn leather case tumbled out, spilling its contents across the concrete floor. Among the scattered items, old photographs, folded papers, a tarnished watch. Something metallic caught the afternoon light streaming through the grimy windows. Jake's military training kicked in instantly as his eyes focused on the object that had rolled near his boot. It was a badge, unlike anything he had seen in his years of service, crafted from what appeared to be blackened silver, with an intricate design that seemed to shift and change depending on the viewing angle. The center bore a symbol that made Jake's blood run cold, a stylized phoenix rising from flames, surrounded by 13 stars arranged in a pattern that spoke of significance far beyond decorative purposes. Murphy had frozen completely, his face draining of color as he stared at the badge lying exposed on his workshop floor, like a ghost from a past he had spent decades trying to forget. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of secrets that had remained buried for nearly half a century. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the badge, but Murphy's voice stopped him cold. "Don't touch that, son." The words carried an authority that seemed to transform the gentle mechanic into something else entirely. Someone accustomed to being obeyed without question in situations where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. Jake's military instincts recognized the tone immediately, and he found himself straightening to attention despite being in civilian clothes in a small-town garage. Murphy slowly bent to retrieve the badge, his movements careful and deliberate, as if handling an unexploded ordnance that could detonate at the slightest provocation. As his fingers closed around the metal, Jake could swear he saw the old man's hands shake, not with age or infirmity, but with the burden of memories that had never been allowed to surface in the harsh light of day. The badge disappeared into Murphy's palm, but its image remained burned into Jake's consciousness like a brand that would never fade. Murphy's voice was barely above a whisper as he began to speak, his eyes distant and unfocused, as if seeing through decades of carefully constructed lies and official denials. He told Jake about a program that existed in the shadows between legitimate military operations and actions so classified they had never appeared in any official documentation. The unit had no name, no insignia that could be traced, no records that would survive congressional hearings or freedom of information requests. They were phantoms who moved through the Cold War landscape like surgical instruments in the hands of masters who understood that sometimes democracy's survival required the violation of its most sacred principles. Murphy's hands moved restlessly as he spoke, gesturing to invisible ghosts that had haunted him through decades of forced retirement in this quiet town where nobody asked questions about his past. The badge represented membership in a brotherhood bound not by oath or ceremony, but by shared knowledge of operations that could never be acknowledged, of decisions made in rooms that officially didn't exist, of actions taken in the name of national security that would horrify the very citizens they were designed to protect. The old man's confession continued in measured tones that spoke of long practice at keeping dangerous secrets locked away in the deepest corners of his mind. He described missions that took them to places American forces had never officially been, conducting operations against enemies who would never be named in history books or congressional testimony. They had been the president's unacknowledged sword, wielded by hands that maintained perfect deniability while blood was shed in America's name across continents where official involvement would have triggered World War III. Murphy had been young then, Jake's age, filled with the same sense of duty and honor that had driven him to volunteer for assignments that came with no glory, no recognition, and the absolute certainty that their sacrifices would never be acknowledged by the nation they served. The unit's existence had been so compartmentalized that even most Pentagon officials remained unaware of their operations, their funding buried in budgets so classified that asking about them was grounds for immediate security review and potential criminal prosecution under laws most Americans had never heard of. As Murphy spoke, Jake began to understand the true magnitude of what he had stumbled upon in this humble repair shop. The badge wasn't just a memento of past service, it was evidence of a program that had operated outside the bounds of law, morality, and congressional oversight for decades during America's most dangerous period. The 13 stars weren't decorative. They represented 13 operations so sensitive that their very existence had been erased from official records using methods that made witnesses disappear and documents vanish as if they had never been created. Murphy's gentle demeanor had been carefully constructed over years of practice. A mask designed to hide the reality of someone who had seen humanity's capacity for darkness and had been forced to become darkness himself in service to ideals he still believed in, despite the cost to his soul. The old mechanic had spent 30 years in this town, fixing cars and offering fatherly advice to young people, all while carrying the weight of secrets that could topple governments and destroy the carefully maintained illusions that allowed decent people to sleep safely in their beds at night. The workshop seemed to shift around them as Murphy's story reached its climax, shadows growing longer as if responding to the darkness being unleashed by his words. He told Jake about the day everything changed, when political winds shifted and their unit became a liability that threatened to expose connections reaching into the highest levels of government. The decision had been made at levels so classified that even Murphy didn't know who had given the final order. But the message was clear: the unit would be disbanded and its members would disappear into carefully constructed new identities. Some had been relocated to foreign countries under assumed names. Others had been given new backgrounds and jobs that would keep them isolated and monitored. A few, Murphy suspected, had been permanently silenced in ways that ensured their secrets would never surface. He had been one of the lucky ones, allowed to live but stripped of his identity, his service record erased so thoroughly that, according to official documents, Thomas Murphy had never served in any branch of the military. His pension had been replaced by a modest settlement that came with explicit understanding. Any attempt to contact former colleagues or discuss past operations would result in immediate consequences that would extend to anyone he had told. But the most chilling revelation was yet to come. As Murphy carefully returned the badge to its hiding place, his hands moving with the precision of long practice, he told Jake the truth that had haunted him through decades of seemingly peaceful retirement. The unit had never been fully disbanded. Core elements continued to operate under even deeper cover, their activities funded through channels that bypassed traditional oversight entirely. Murphy had seen the signs over the years, unusual visitors to town who watched his shop from carefully chosen vantage points, phone calls that ended abruptly when he answered, mail that arrived opened despite postal regulations. They were still watching him, still monitoring his activities, still ready to act if he showed any sign of becoming a security risk. The badge he had kept all these years wasn't just a memento. It was evidence of a crime that had no statute of limitations, proof of involvement in operations that powerful people had spent billions to keep buried. Every day he chose not to destroy it was an act of defiance that could cost him everything he had built in this quiet town where people trusted him with their problems and their vehicles. Jake's world tilted as he processed the implications of Murphy's confession. The old man wasn't just a former soldier with interesting stories. He was a walking classified document whose very existence threatened to expose operations that could destabilize international relationships and destroy careers spanning decades. The workshop around them suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a carefully monitored prison where Murphy served his sentence for crimes he couldn't discuss and honors he couldn't claim. Jake understood now why the mechanic had been so careful with the badge, why his reaction had been immediate and instinctive. In the wrong hands, that piece of metal could trigger investigations that would reach into the Pentagon, the CIA, and possibly the White House itself. Murphy had trusted him with knowledge that made Jake complicit in secrets that could end both their lives, and the weight of that responsibility settled onto his shoulders like armor he hadn't asked to wear but couldn't remove. The sound of approaching footsteps outside the garage froze both men in place, their conversation dying as survival instincts honed by different conflicts kicked into overdrive. Murphy's transformation was instantaneous. The gentle mechanic disappeared, replaced by someone who moved with lethal purpose despite his advanced years. His hand moved to a tool rack, where Jake now noticed certain implements seemed designed for purposes that had nothing to do with automotive repair. Through the grimy windows, shadows moved with the systematic precision of a coordinated surveillance operation, and Jake realized that Murphy's watchers had finally decided their conversation had gone too far. The old man's eyes met his with an intensity that communicated volumes about the danger they now faced together. Years of careful monitoring had been replaced by direct action, and Jake understood that their discovery of the badge had triggered protocols that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Murphy gestured toward a back door that Jake hadn't noticed before, its lock mechanism far more sophisticated than anything needed for a small-town repair shop. Murphy moved with surprising speed as he gathered essential items from hidden locations throughout the workshop, each movement economical and practiced as if he had rehearsed this evacuation countless times over the decades. He pressed a small device into Jake's hand, a secure communication unit that looked military in origin but bore no identifying markings. "If we get separated," Murphy whispered, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to operating in life-or-death situations, "use Channel 7 and identify yourself as Eagle's Nest. Tell them Thomas Murphy is active and requests immediate extraction protocol Delta 7. They'll understand." Jake's military training told him to ask questions, to demand explanations, but the sound of vehicles surrounding the building made it clear that time for questions had passed. Murphy's expression softened for a moment as he looked around the workshop that had been his home and sanctuary for 3 decades, knowing he would never see it again. The gentle mechanic who had spent his retirement years helping neighbors and sharing wisdom with young soldiers was disappearing forever, replaced by the ghost of a warrior who had never really been allowed to rest. The back door opened onto an alley that seemed empty, but felt wrong in ways Jake's combat experience couldn't quite identify. Murphy moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent a lifetime in hostile territory, his aged body remembering skills that had been drilled into him decades earlier. They made it 3 blocks before the first shots rang out, muzzle flashes sparking from rooftops and doorways with the coordinated precision of a military operation designed to leave no survivors or witnesses. Murphy returned fire with a pistol that had appeared in his hand as if by magic, his shooting stance textbook perfect despite his age. Jake found cover behind a parked car, his mind struggling to reconcile the reality of a firefight in suburban America with the quiet afternoon he had expected when he brought his truck in for repair. Murphy's movements were those of a professional who had spent decades perfecting the art of staying alive in situations where failure meant not just personal death, but the exposure of secrets that could reshape global politics and military doctrine. The pursuit continued through narrow streets and residential neighborhoods where the sounds of gunfire seemed surreal against the backdrop of normal American life. Murphy led them through a maze of back alleys and abandoned buildings, his knowledge of escape routes suggesting he had spent years preparing for this moment. Jake followed, his respect for the old mechanic growing with each tactical decision that kept them ahead of their pursuers. These weren't ordinary security contractors. Their equipment, coordination, and willingness to engage in open warfare suggested resources that could only come from the highest levels of government. Murphy paused at an intersection, his breathing heavy but controlled as he checked the communication device Jake carried. The display showed encrypted messages that confirmed what Jake had begun to suspect. Murphy's former colleagues had been activated and extraction teams were moving into position. The decades-old network of survivors was still functional, still capable of protecting its own, when the carefully maintained balance of secrets and silence was threatened by exposure. The final confrontation took place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a location Murphy had apparently selected for its strategic advantages and symbolic significance. As their pursuers closed in, the old mechanic's demeanor shifted one final time, becoming something that belonged more in classified briefings than small-town repair shops. He explained to Jake that the badge had been more than a memento. It was a key that unlocked access to files and accounts that could expose decades of illegal operations. The people hunting them weren't trying to silence a whistleblower. They were attempting to recover evidence that could trigger congressional investigations and international incidents that would reshape American foreign policy. Murphy had spent 30 years as a living dead drop, keeping the most dangerous secrets safely buried while maintaining the appearance of a harmless civilian. The discovery of his badge had activated protocols designed to eliminate any threat to operational security, regardless of the cost in lives or the exposure of current operations. As extraction helicopters appeared on the horizon, Murphy made his final choice. He pressed the badge into Jake's hand, along with coordinates to a safe house and instructions for contacting journalists who specialized in government accountability. The old mechanic had decided that 3 decades of silence had been enough, that the price of keeping secrets had become higher than the cost of revealing them. His sacrifice would ensure that Jake survived to tell the story of a program that had operated beyond law and morality, protected by officials who valued power more than the principles they had sworn to defend. Murphy's last words were not of regret for the life he had lived or the secrets he had kept, but of hope that the truth might finally serve the country he had loved enough to damn himself for. The gentle mechanic who had spent his retirement years fixing broken things had found one final repair job, healing the damage done by decades of necessary lies and impossible choices that had protected America at the cost of its soul. The warehouse echoed with the sound of approaching helicopters as Jake clutched the badge that had started everything, understanding finally that some secrets were too important to keep and some truths too dangerous to ignore. Murphy's story would survive, carried by a young soldier who had learned that heroism sometimes meant choosing exposure over protection, accountability over security. The old man's legacy would be measured not in the operations he had completed or the secrets he had kept, but in his final decision to trust the future with the truth about the past. In death, Thomas Murphy had achieved something that had eluded him in 30 years of careful retirement. He had finally found peace with the choices that had defined his life and the secrets that had consumed his soul. The extraction team descended from black helicopters with the precision of operators who had conducted similar missions in hostile territories around the world. Jake watched from his concealed position as Murphy engaged the final wave of pursuers, his movements still fluid despite the toll of their running battle through Cedar Falls. The old mechanic's training remained sharp after decades of dormancy, each shot calculated to maximize tactical advantage while minimizing collateral damage to the innocent civilians whose quiet lives had been shattered by the resurrection of secrets they never knew existed. Murphy's voice crackled through Jake's communication device, calm and professional as he coordinated with the extraction team using call signs and protocols that belonged to operations manual pages that had been burned decades ago. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that Murphy's final mission would be conducted by the same shadow organization that had erased his existence and forced him into 30 years of exile disguised as retirement. The warehouse became a battlefield as multiple forces converged with competing objectives and overlapping jurisdictions that created chaos in the carefully planned operation. Murphy's extraction team moved with surgical precision, their black tactical gear unmarked by any identifying patches or insignia that could be traced back to official military units. Their opponents fought with equal skill, but different desperation. These were cleanup specialists whose failure would mean exposure of programs that reached into the highest levels of government. Jake realized he was witnessing the collision of two parallel worlds that had coexisted in uneasy tension for decades, each side bound by oaths and obligations that demanded absolute commitment regardless of personal cost. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the industrial district as Murphy fought his way toward the extraction point, covering Jake's movement with the tactical awareness of someone who had spent a lifetime calculating angles of fire and escape routes, in environments where mistakes were measured in body counts rather than mission failures. Murphy's past caught up with him in the form of a figure emerging from the shadows, a man Jake's age wearing civilian clothes but moving with the unmistakable bearing of special operations training. The confrontation was brief but loaded with the weight of shared history and betrayed loyalties that had festered for 30 years. Murphy recognized his former teammate instantly, despite decades of careful plastic surgery and identity reconstruction that had transformed him into someone officially non-existent. Their conversation was conducted in the shorthand of professionals who had once trusted each other with their lives and their darkest secrets, but who now found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict that had been inevitable since the day their unit was officially disbanded. The former teammates' orders were clear: recover the evidence and eliminate all witnesses, including Murphy, whose knowledge of past operations made him a permanent security risk that could no longer be managed through surveillance and containment protocols. The final gunfight lasted less than 60 seconds, but contained the concentrated violence of decades of suppressed conflict between loyalty and duty, honor and survival. Murphy moved with the lethal grace of someone who had spent his youth perfecting the art of killing, in service to ideals he still believed in, despite the betrayals and compromises that had defined his adult life. His opponent fought with the desperation of someone who understood that failure would mean exposure not just of past crimes, but of current operations that depended on maintaining the fiction that certain programs had ended when political expedience demanded their official termination. Jake watched from cover as two master warriors engaged in combat that represented the collision of everything the American military stood for with everything it had been forced to become in order to survive in a world where traditional warfare was insufficient to protect national interests. The outcome was decided not by superior skill or equipment, but by Murphy's willingness to accept death as the price of ensuring that the truth would survive him. Murphy fell with the badge still clutched in his hand, his final act pressing it firmly into Jake's palm, along with coordinates that would lead to safety and allies who could ensure the story reached people capable of demanding accountability. The old mechanic's death was not the quiet passing he had probably imagined during his years of forced retirement, but it carried the dignity of someone who had finally found a way to serve his country that aligned with his conscience rather than contradicting it. His sacrifice transformed the badge from evidence of participation in illegal operations into proof of the courage required to acknowledge past mistakes and work toward preventing their repetition. Jake understood that Murphy's legacy would be measured not in the lives he had taken or the secrets he had kept, but in his final choice to trust the future with truth rather than protecting the present with continued deception and institutional denial. The extraction helicopters lifted off as dawn broke over Cedar Falls, carrying Jake and the evidence that would ultimately expose decades of operations conducted in America's name, but outside the boundaries of law, morality, and congressional oversight. The small town would return to its quiet routine, but the garage, where Thomas Murphy had spent 30 years fixing broken things, would remain empty, a monument to the price paid by those who serve their country in ways that can never be acknowledged or honored. Jake's mission was just beginning. He carried not just Murphy's badge, but the responsibility of ensuring that the old mechanic's sacrifice would lead to the kind of accountability that prevented future generations of soldiers from facing the impossible choices that had defined Murphy's life. The truth about the shadow programs would emerge slowly, filtered through congressional hearings and investigative journalism that would reshape public understanding of how democracy survives in a world where its enemies follow no rules and respect no boundaries.